The morning sun filtered through the wide front windows of Murphy's diner, casting long golden streaks across the checkered linoleum floor. The familiar sounds of breakfast service filled the air, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the gentle clink of coffee cups against saucers, and the low murmur of early morning conversations. Jake Martinez sat in his usual corner booth, watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma wrestle with a stack of chocolate chip pancakes that seemed to dwarf her small frame. Her tongue poked out slightly in concentration as she carefully cut each piece, syrup pooling around the edges of her plate like sweet amber lakes. "Easy there, kiddo," Jake said with a gentle smile, reaching over to steady her fork when it slipped. "They're not going anywhere." Emma looked up with bright hazel eyes, her mother's eyes, and grinned. "I know, Daddy, but they taste better when they're the right size." Jake's chest tightened, with the familiar ache that came whenever Emma reminded him of Sarah. 3 years had passed since the car accident, but moments like these still caught him off guard. The way Emma tilted her head when she concentrated, her precise little habits, all echoes of the woman he'd lost. "Are we still going to the park after breakfast?" Emma asked, syrup decorating the corner of her mouth. "Absolutely," Jake confirmed, handing her a napkin. "Mrs. Rodriguez said she'd watch you practice your reading while I finish some paperwork this afternoon." Their Saturday routine was sacred. Pancakes at Murphy's, playground time, then quiet hours at home where Jake could catch up on the administrative side of his small landscaping business. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it had become the anchor that kept them both steady in the years since Sarah's death. Jake took a sip of his black coffee, savoring the bitter warmth, when movement across the diner caught his attention. Their waitress, a young woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, was serving coffee to a man in an expensive suit at the counter. Jake had noticed her before, always professional, always smiling, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she carried more weight than someone her age should. Her name tag read Casey, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd been doing this job for a while. But as Jake watched, he noticed something that made him pause mid-sip. The man at the counter, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that screamed money and influence, was leaning too close. His hand lingered on the countertop where Casey had to reach for the coffee pot, forcing her to brush against him. Jake saw Casey's smile falter for just a moment, a flash of discomfort crossing her features before she quickly composed herself. The man said something Jake couldn't hear, but Casey's response was a tight nod, her knuckles white as she gripped the coffee pot. "Daddy." Emma's voice pulled Jake back to their table. "You're making your worried face." Jake blinked, realizing he'd been staring. "Sorry, sweetheart. Just thinking about work stuff." But his attention kept drifting back to the counter. The man, who Jake now noticed wore a city council pin on his lapel, had positioned himself so that Casey had to squeeze past him to reach other customers. Each time she tried to move away, he found a reason to engage her, his hand occasionally accidentally touching her arm or shoulder. Casey's professional smile never wavered, but Jake could see the tension in her posture, the way she kept glancing toward the kitchen, as if calculating the distance to safety. Other customers seemed oblivious, absorbed in their own breakfasts and conversations. "Daddy, she looks scared," Emma whispered, following his gaze. Jake's heart sank. If his 8-year-old could see it, it was obvious. Casey was trapped between maintaining her professional composure and dealing with behavior that was clearly making her uncomfortable. "You're right, kiddo," Jake said quietly. "She does look scared." Emma put down her fork, her young face serious. "Why isn't anyone helping her?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. Why wasn't anyone helping? He looked around the diner. Other patrons were focused on their own meals. The elderly cook was busy at the grill, and the manager was nowhere to be seen. Casey was handling this alone, as she probably had been for who knew how long. Jake thought about staying out of it. The man was clearly someone important. That council pin suggested connections that could make things difficult for anyone who crossed him. Jake had Emma to think about, a business to protect. The safe thing would be to finish breakfast and leave, but then he caught Casey's eye for a brief moment across the diner. The pleading look she gave him, desperate, hopeful, quickly hidden behind her professional mask, made his decision. "Stay here, Emma," Jake said, standing up. "I'll be right back. Where are you going?" Jake paused, looking down at his daughter's worried face. This was a teaching moment, whether he'd planned it or not. Someone needs help, sweetheart. And when someone needs help, good people don't just walk away. Jake approached the counter with deliberate calm, sliding onto the stool next to the well-dressed man. Up close he could see the man's expensive watch, his manicured nails, the subtle arrogance in his posture that spoke of a lifetime of getting his way. "Excuse me," Jake said to Casey, his voice friendly but clear enough to carry. "Could I get a coffee refill when you have a minute?" Casey's relief was almost palpable. "Of course," she said, her voice steadier now. Right away, the man turned slightly, giving Jake an appraising look that clearly found him wanting. Work clothes, calloused hands, the general appearance of someone who earned his living with his back rather than his connections. "I'm Richard Blackwood," the man said, not offering his hand. "I don't believe we've met." "Jake Martinez," Jake replied evenly. "I run Martinez Landscaping." Blackwood's expression shifted slightly, the look of someone placing a person in their proper social hierarchy. "Ah, a landscaper. Well, I'm sure you do good work." The condescension was deliberate, but Jake let it slide. His focus was on Casey, who was pouring his coffee with hands that were no longer shaking. "Casey's been telling me about the excellent service here," Blackwood continued, his hand moving to rest on the counter closer to where Casey stood. "We were just discussing how accommodating the staff can be to regular customers." The implication in his tone made Jake's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "I bet they appreciate customers who respect their professionalism." Blackwood's smile turned cold. "Oh, I always show my appreciation appropriately." As if to demonstrate, his hand moved to briefly touch Casey's wrist as she set down Jake's coffee. The contact was quick, could have been dismissed as accidental. But Jake saw Casey flinch. "Careful there," Jake said quietly, his eyes meeting Blackwood's. "Wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong impression." The temperature at the counter seemed to drop several degrees. Blackwood straightened, his political smile vanishing. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Martinez, was it?" "I'm not implying anything," Jake said, taking a deliberate sip of his coffee. "Just making conversation with a fellow customer about treating service workers with respect." Casey had moved a step back, but Jake could see her watching the interaction with a mixture of hope and fear. Around them, other customers were beginning to notice the tension. Blackwood leaned closer, his voice low and threatening. "You know, I sit on the City Planning Commission. I review permits for landscaping contracts, zoning approvals for small businesses. I'd hate for someone to find themselves having difficulties with city bureaucracy over a misunderstanding." The threat was clear, professional retaliation for personal interference. Jake felt his pulse quicken, thinking of Emma, of the contracts that kept them afloat, of the precarious nature of small business survival. But then he heard Emma's voice from across the diner. "Daddy, is the mean man being nicer to the lady now?" Her innocent words carried across the suddenly quiet restaurant, and Jake saw several other patrons turning to look. Blackwood's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment. Jake couldn't tell. "Your daughter seems to have quite an imagination," Blackwood said tightly. "Kids see things pretty clearly," Jake replied. "No imagination required." Casey had retreated toward the kitchen, but she was watching, waiting to see how this would resolve. Jake could feel the weight of the moment, not just for her, but for Emma, who was learning what it meant to stand up for others. Jake pulled out his wallet and placed a 20 on the counter. Well more than enough for their breakfast. "Casey, thanks for the great service." As always, he stood meeting Blackwood's glare with steady calm. "Enjoy your breakfast, councilman. I'm sure the staff will continue to provide the professional service this place is known for." The emphasis on professional was unmistakable. Blackwood's hand tightened into a fist on the counter. But with the attention of the entire diner now focused on them, He couldn't escalate without exposing himself further. Jake walked back to Emma, who was watching with wide eyes. "Ready to go to the park, kiddo? Did you help the scared lady, Daddy?" Jake glanced back at Casey, who gave him a small, grateful smile. "I tried, sweetheart. Sometimes that's all we can do, try to help when someone needs it." As they prepared to leave, Casey approached their table. "Thank you," she said quietly to Jake. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Jake replied simply. "Nobody should have to deal with that alone." Casey knelt down to Emma's level. "Thank you too, sweetie. You helped by noticing and caring." Emma beamed with pride. "My daddy says good people don't walk away when someone needs help." "Your daddy's right," Casey said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. As they left Murphy's diner, Jake felt Emma slip her small hand into his. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she said seriously. Jake squeezed her hand gently. "I'm proud of you too, Em, for seeing what was wrong and wanting to help. The park could wait a few more minutes." Right now, Jake was content to walk slowly with his daughter, knowing that she'd learned something important about courage, about standing up for others, about the cost and value of doing what's right. Behind them, through the diner's window, Jake could see Casey moving with renewed confidence, her smile genuine now. And Councilman Blackwood was nowhere to be seen. Sometimes, Jake reflected, the most important battles were fought not with grand gestures, but with simple human decency and the courage to speak up when others couldn't. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon against bullies was the clear, honest voice of a child, asking why no one was helping. Emma skipped beside him as they headed toward the playground, her faith in her father's goodness intact, her understanding of right and wrong a little clearer. For a single dad doing his best to raise a good human being in a complicated world, that felt like victory enough.